The storm came in hard that night, the way storms only come in the high desert of Arizona, fast and mean, and with a violence that felt personal. Jack Mercer was in his garage, lying on a creeper under a 1972 Ford pickup, when the first boom of thunder shook the tin roof so hard he thought the whole thing was coming down on him. He slid out from under the truck, wiped grease off his hands with a rag that had been gray for so long it had forgotten its original color, and stood at the open bay door, watching the sky turn itself inside out. The wind whipped across the scrubland, bending the creosote bushes flat, and the rain came not in drops, but in curtains, silver sheets that swallowed the highway and the fence line and the world beyond his driveway. He was about to pull the door shut when he heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm like a knife through canvas. A knock. Not a polite rap at the front door, but a desperate pounding that came from the side of the house, near the kitchen entrance. Jack stood still for a moment, listening. The knock came again, harder this time, and then a voice, high, thin, breaking at the edges, called out, "Please! Please, somebody open the door!" He moved through the garage, through the mudroom, and into the kitchen. The porch light was off. He never turned it on, but through the window he could see a shape pressed against the door, small and soaked and shaking. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, and the storm rushed in like it had been waiting for exactly this chance. There were three of them. A boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, stood at the front with a bundle wrapped in a blue blanket clutched to his chest. The rain had plastered his hair to his skull, and his eyes were wide and dark. The eyes of someone who had run out of options and was now banking everything on the stranger standing in front of him. Behind him, pressed tight against his back, was a girl, younger, maybe 7 or 8, with a stuffed rabbit under one arm, and a look on her face that was not quite fear. It was something older than fear, something that had moved past it into a deep, weary silence. And in the boy's arms, the bundle squirmed and let out a thin, miserable cry. "Please," the boy said. His voice was hoarse, but he held it steady. "She's getting cold." "I've been trying to keep her warm, but she's getting cold, and I didn't know where else to go." Jack looked past them into the darkness behind the house. The rain was a solid wall, but for just a moment, one fleeting second, he caught the glow of red taillights at the far end of the dirt road that led to his property. They sat there, motionless, watching. Then the lights blinked out, and the darkness swallowed them whole. Jack stepped back from the door. "Come inside." The boy moved immediately, ducking past Jack with the practiced urgency of someone who has learned to move fast in tight spaces. The girl hesitated on the threshold, looking up at Jack with those old, watchful eyes. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then the words came, unbidden, from a place inside him he hadn't visited in over a decade. "It's all right. Come on in out of the rain." She stepped inside, and Jack closed the door behind her, locking it with a turn of the deadbolt that felt heavier than it should have. Before we go any further into Jack Mercer's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me what city you're watching from today. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's get back to that night. The boy laid the bundle down on the kitchen table with the careful, trembling hands of a bomb disposal expert. He peeled back the folds of the blue blanket, and Jack saw the baby underneath. She was tiny, too tiny, he thought, even for a newborn, and her skin had a waxy, flushed quality that made the back of his neck prickle. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing came in quick, shallow gasps. "How old is she?" Jack asked. "Almost 3 weeks," the boy said. "Her name is Hope. She's got a fever. It started this morning, and it's been getting worse. She finished her last bottle about 2 hours ago." Jack was already moving toward the cabinet above the refrigerator where he kept a first aid kit that was mostly out of date but had a digital thermometer and some basic supplies. He wasn't a doctor. He had no business treating a sick infant, and he knew that. But the boy was watching him with a look that said he had made a decision somewhere in the dark of that terrible night, that Jack Mercer was the person who was going to fix this. And the weight of that decision settled on Jack's shoulders like a physical thing he hadn't expected to carry. "I've got formula," the girl said. It was the first time she'd spoken. Her voice was soft and careful, like she had learned to pick her words the way other children pick flowers. In my bag, 2 cans. She held out a small backpack, waterlogged and frayed, one strap held together with a safety pin. Jack took it from her, and she watched him with those eyes that seemed to measure every move he made. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily." She pointed to the boy. "That's Ethan, he's my brother." "And Hope?" "She's ours." Lily's voice didn't waver. "We take care of her." Jack found a small pot, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. He opened the backpack, pulled out the formula, and measured it out with a quiet efficiency that surprised even himself. He had done this before, a long time ago, in another life. The motions came back to him like a song he thought he'd forgotten. While the water heated, he looked at Ethan. "Is there someone I should call? Your mother? Your father?" The 2 children exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, but Jack caught it. It was a signal, a silent negotiation that spoke volumes about the secrets they carried. "Our mother sent us here," Ethan said. "Where is she?" Another glance, longer this time. "We don't know," Lily whispered. Jack tested the formula against his wrist, the same way Margaret used to test their daughter's bottles, and the memory hit him so hard he had to pause and steady his hand. He pushed it down, the way he had pushed it down 1,000 times before, and carried the bottle to the table. He looked at the baby, and he stopped. He had not held a child since Sophie. He had not touched a baby, not been in the same room as one, if he could help it, for 12 years. There was a reason for that. A carefully maintained wall he had built brick by brick to keep himself safe from exactly this kind of moment. "Can you?" he started. "Please," Ethan said. The word was soft and direct. "She does better when a grown-up holds her. She calms down." Jack sat down in the kitchen chair he had sat in every morning for 12 years. The same chair, the same spot, the same view of the same empty room. He picked up the baby. She was so light, so small, that he could feel her ribs through the thin blanket. He brought the bottle to her lips, and Hope latched on with the fierce, focused determination of the very young and the very hungry, drinking as if she knew there was no guarantee of a next meal. And something happened in Jack Mercer's chest that he could not name and did not want to look at directly. Something cracked. Something opened. "There's a note," Ethan said. He reached into the front pocket of his soaked jeans and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was wrinkled and damp, the ink blurred at the edges but still legible. He set it on the table in front of Jack. Jack looked at it without picking it up. The handwriting was a woman's, small, fast, slightly tilted, the handwriting of someone who wrote quickly because they were always in a hurry or always afraid. "Please protect them all. Someone is looking for us." That was all it said. Jack read it twice, then looked up at Ethan. "Who sent you here?" "Our mom." "I understand that. I'm asking why here. Why me?" Ethan sat down across from him. The boy's face was doing something complicated, working through the calculation of how much truth to offer and how much to keep back. Jack recognized that calculation. He had been running it himself for 12 years. "She said you were the only one she trusted," Ethan said finally. "She said you helped her once, a long time ago. She said you were the kind of man who stays." "The kind of man who stays," Jack repeated. "Yes, sir." Jack looked down at the baby in his arms. Hope had finished the bottle and was watching him with the unfocused, serious gaze of a newborn who hasn't learned yet that the world isn't always safe. He thought about calling social services, the sheriff's department, someone whose job it was to handle this sort of thing. He thought about the red taillights sitting in the rain at the end of the road, and he thought about the note with its simple, desperate plea. "All right," he said. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning. Right now, I need you two to eat something, and then get some sleep." Lily said, "We haven't eaten since morning." "I know." Jack stood up carefully, shifting Hope to his shoulder, and opened the refrigerator with his free hand. "I've got bread, eggs, some leftover chili. You eat chili?" "We eat anything," Ethan said. The bluntness of it, the matter-of-fact honesty of a child who has learned not to expect plenty, hit Jack somewhere low and hard. He made eggs because they were fastest, scrambling them on the old gas stove, while Lily sat at the table and watched him with those careful eyes. And Ethan walked through the house like a patrolman, checking windows, checking doors, his head turning at every sound. Jack watched the boy do it and didn't say anything. Telling this boy to relax would have been an insult to whatever had made him this way. They ate at the kitchen table at midnight. Jack put Hope in a laundry basket lined with towels, not a crib, but the best he could do on short notice, and the baby slept. Lily ate 2 full portions of eggs and half a piece of toast, and then put her head down on her arms and was asleep before Jack could find sheets for the spare bedroom. Ethan stayed awake. Jack carried Lily to the spare room and laid her on the bare mattress, covering her with a quilt that had been in the closet since Margaret put it there 12 years ago. He came back to the kitchen and sat down across from Ethan, and the two of them looked at each other across the table, the way 2 people look at each other when they both know an honest conversation is coming. "Tell me what I need to know," Jack said. Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked older than 10. He looked like someone who had been old for a long time. "Mom said don't tell anyone. Your mom isn't here right now, I am. And I've got 3 children in my house in the middle of the night and a note that says someone is looking for you. So you're going to tell me what you can, and I'm going to decide what to do with it." Ethan looked at his hands. There was grease under his fingernails, Jack noticed. The kind of grease that comes from working on machines, not from playing. "There's a man," Ethan said slowly. "His name is Calvin Rhodes. He owns a big construction company over in Maricopa County. He does a lot of work out near the border." "I know of him," Jack said, keeping his voice neutral. "Mom worked in his office for a while last year. She did bookkeeping." Ethan paused, started again. "She found some stuff in the files, stuff about workers, people who came over from Mexico to work on his projects. And then he stopped. "They disappeared. She said there were names, a lot of names." The kitchen felt very quiet. "Did she go to the police?" Jack asked. Ethan let out a short, flat laugh that didn't belong on a boy's face. "The sheriff out in that county plays golf with Rhodes every Saturday. Mom knew that before she even picked up the phone. So she ran. She hid us. First at my aunt's, then with a lady from church, then—" He spread his hands. "It kept not working. Someone always found out where we were. She said there was a leak somewhere. She said she couldn't trust anyone with a phone or an address that Rhodes could find. But she trusted me. She said she met you on the highway when she was 19. Her car broke down and you fixed it. You didn't ask for anything, and you didn't try anything. And when she asked why, you just said that's what people are supposed to do for each other." Ethan looked up. "She said she never forgot that. She said some men you can just tell." Jack was quiet for a moment. He didn't remember the girl from the highway. He had stopped for people on that road 100 times over the years because that was what you did in the desert, where a broken-down car in the summer heat could kill you. Not remembering her specifically didn't matter. The story was exactly the kind of thing he would have done, and the kind of thing he would not have thought worth remembering. "Where did she go?" he asked. "She said she had to get the evidence somewhere safe. She had copies of documents. She was going to mail them somewhere, she said, and then come get us." Ethan's voice stayed steady and level, but Jack could see the cost of that steadiness in the way the boy's hands gripped the edge of the table. "That was 11 days ago." 11 days? "Yes, sir." "And in 11 days you've heard nothing?" "No, sir." Jack looked at the baby sleeping in the laundry basket. He looked at the crack of light under the door of the spare room where Lily was sleeping. He looked at this 10-year-old boy sitting across from him with grease under his nails and old eyes, and 11 days of being the only adult these children had. "All right," Jack said. "All right what?" "All right. You're staying here until we figure out what happened to your mother and what to do about this Rhodes situation. You sleep. I'll watch tonight." Ethan stared at him. Something moved across the boy's face, a loosening, like a knot finally giving. And for just a moment, Jack saw the 10-year-old underneath all that hard-won control. "You believe me?" "I believe you. Most adults don't." "I know." Jack stood up. "Go sleep." Ethan stood too. He picked up his plate and carried it to the sink and rinsed it without being asked. Then he stopped in the doorway and turned back. "Mr. Mercer?" "Just Jack." "Jack." The boy hesitated. "The truck you saw on the road, was it a black long bed? No plates?" Jack felt something cold move through him. "Yes." Ethan nodded, a slow nod of confirmation, not surprise. That's one of his. They've been following us for 3 days. I didn't know they'd found us again until just now. Then he walked down the hall to the spare room and closed the door. Jack sat alone in his kitchen with a baby sleeping in a laundry basket and a cold stove and a piece of paper on the table that said, "Please protect them all." He thought about the 12 years of silence he had built so carefully around himself, and about the red taillights disappearing into the desert rain, and about the way a 10-year-old boy carries a newborn against his chest in a thunderstorm with the locked-down certainty of someone who knows that if he lets go, everything falls. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen chair where he had eaten alone for 12 years, and he watched the baby breathe, and he listened to the storm move on across the desert. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, a truck drove slowly past on the highway without stopping, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of the kitchen. Jack sat very still and waited until the sound of its engine faded into the dark. Then he got up and made coffee and stood at the window until the sky began to go gray, and the desert began to come out of the dark, and Red Hollow, Arizona came back to life, one pale inch at a time. The 3 children sleeping in his house breathed on unharmed through the long remainder of the night, and for the first time in 12 years, Jack Mercer had a reason to watch the sun come up. The sun came up hard and hot, the way it always did in Red Hollow in July, and by 7 in the morning the temperature had already crossed 90 degrees. Jack had drunk 3 cups of coffee and was working on his 4th when he heard the first scream. It came from the spare room, sharp, high, full of a terror that had nothing to do with waking up. It was a scream that came from somewhere inside sleep, from whatever place the mind goes when it stops protecting itself. Jack was down the hall in 4 steps. He pushed open the door and found Lily sitting straight up on the mattress, both hands pressed flat against her chest, her eyes wide open and seeing something that wasn't in the room. "Hey!" Jack crouched down to her level. "Hey, you're here, you're in the house, nobody's coming in." Lily blinked, and her eyes slowly came back to the present. Her breathing was ragged and shallow. Ethan was already awake in the corner of the room, where he had apparently slept on the floor instead of taking the bed, and he was watching his sister with an expression of exhausted familiarity. This had happened before. "It's the same one," Lily said to no one in particular. "The man with the ring. He always has the same face." "What man?" Jack asked. Lily looked at him like she had forgotten he was a stranger. Then she picked up the stuffed rabbit from beside her, pressed it under her chin, and didn't answer. Ethan caught Jack's eye and gave a small shake of his head. "Later." Jack nodded and straightened up. "Breakfast in 10 minutes, he said, as if this were a normal morning, as if screaming children and sleepless nights and black trucks on the highway were things that happened every day in this kitchen. He said it in the same flat, practical voice he used when he told customers how long a repair was going to take. Sometimes that was the most useful thing you could offer a person, the sound of someone who was not panicking. He went out to the garage to check on something he had been thinking about since 3 in the morning, and he found it inside of 2 minutes. The lock on the side door had been worked, not broken. Whoever it was had been careful, had known what they were doing. But the scratch marks on the strike plate were fresh, and the door had been opened and closed again. A wooden crate of old parts near the back wall had been moved about 8 inches from where Jack always kept it. Someone had been in his garage in the night. While he sat in the kitchen watching the baby breathe, someone had come through the side door and gone through his things and left again, quiet as smoke. Jack stood in the middle of the garage for a long moment. Then he went back inside and made pancakes. He didn't tell the children what he had found, not yet. Instead, he watched Ethan eat. The boy put away 6 pancakes without slowing down, and he watched Lily feed small pieces of hers to the stuffed rabbit with a seriousness that made his chest ache. And he fed Hope her morning bottle and felt the baby's forehead with the back of his hand and did not like what he felt. The fever was lower than last night, but it hadn't broken. It was sitting there in her small body like something waiting to decide. "She needs to see a doctor," Jack said. Ethan put his fork down. "We can't go to a hospital. They log names. Rhodes has people who look at those logs. I'm not talking about a hospital. Doc Harmon's been practicing in this town for 30 years. He makes house calls. He doesn't log anything he doesn't have to. Ethan and Lily exchanged their look again. That wordless negotiation Jack was getting faster at reading. Finally, Ethan said, "Okay, just him, nobody else." Jack called Doc Harmon from the kitchen phone. While it rang, he walked as far as the cord would reach and looked out the window. There, parked at the far edge of the property where the gravel lot met the scrubby line of desert brush, was a dark blue sedan he had never seen before. Not black, blue, different vehicle. He watched it for the 30 seconds it took Doc Harmon to answer, and by the time he had made the appointment, it was gone. The wind came howling off the eastern flats like a thing possessed, carrying dust and the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Jeremiah Cole sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sky turn the color of a bad bruise, and he thought, not for the first time, that the Texas Panhandle in spring had a way of making a man feel smaller than he already was. He was 53 years old, with hands that had been cracked and calloused for so long they looked more like leather than skin, and he had been alone on this stretch of land for 8 years. 8 years since the fever took Mary. 8 years since he buried her under the cottonwood tree at the back of the property, and stood there with his hat in his hands until the sun went down and the coyotes began to sing. 8 years of cattle and fences, and the kind of silence that gets into a man's bones and stays there. The first drop of rain hit the porch boards with a sound like a struck bell, then another, and then the sky opened up and let loose a deluge that turned the yard into mud in less than a minute. Jeremiah stood up to go inside when he heard a sound that didn't belong. A horse, coming fast. He squinted through the sheets of rain and saw a shape emerge from the gray. A small figure on a mottled pony, bent low over the animal's neck, riding straight for his cabin. Behind the first horse came a second, smaller, carrying another rider. Jeremiah stepped off the porch and walked toward them, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. The lead horse came to a stop in front of him, and the rider slid off before the animal had fully halted. It was a boy, maybe 10 years old, soaked through, his face streaked with rain and something that might have been tears. In his arms, he clutched a bundle wrapped in a wool blanket, and even before the boy spoke, Jeremiah could hear the thin, reedy cry of an infant. "Mister," the boy said, his voice breathless and urgent. "Please, my sister, she's burning up. I don't know what else to do." Before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me what city you're watching from today. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's get back to that porch. Jeremiah looked past the boy to the second rider, who had dismounted and was standing a few feet away, a girl, younger, maybe 7 or 8, with a stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm and eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. Her dress was plastered to her thin frame, and she was shivering so hard he could see it from where he stood. "Get inside," Jeremiah said. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He turned and led them into the cabin, where a fire was still burning in the stone hearth. The boy laid the bundle on the worn wooden table and peeled back the blanket, and Jeremiah saw the infant beneath. She was small, too small, even for a newborn, and her skin had a waxy, flushed quality that made his stomach clench. Her breathing was fast and shallow, and her eyes were closed as if she had given up on the world before fully entering it. "How old?" Jeremiah asked. 3 weeks tomorrow, the boy said. "Her name is Grace. She's been hot all day. We ran out of milk for her about 4 hours ago." Jeremiah was already moving to the cupboard, where he kept a tin of condensed milk and a bottle he had used years ago for an orphaned lamb. He mixed it quickly, testing it against his wrist, the way Mary had taught him when their own son was alive. The memory came sharp and painful, and he pushed it down with practiced force. He brought the bottle to the table and looked at the baby, then at the boy. "You know how to do this?" The boy nodded and took the bottle. He sat down in the chair, cradled the infant in the crook of his arm, and brought the nipple to her lips. The baby latched on with a desperate urgency, and the boy's face softened into something that was almost relief. Jeremiah turned to the girl, who was standing near the door, dripping water onto the floorboards. She hadn't moved since entering. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lydia," she said. Her voice was quiet and careful, like a person who measured each word before letting it out. but everybody calls me Lily. I'm Jeremiah. This is my place." Lily nodded, her eyes never leaving him. There was no fear in them, not exactly, but a watchfulness that suggested she had learned to be careful around strangers. "That's Caleb," she said, pointing to her brother. "And the baby is Grace. Where's your mother?" The girl's face flickered, and Caleb looked up from the bottle. The two children exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, but carried the weight of a long conversation. "She sent us here," Caleb said. "She said to find the man with the white fence and the cottonwood tree in the back. She said you'd help us." Jeremiah didn't own a white fence. He didn't own a cottonwood tree on his property. The only cottonwood was half a mile down the road, on land that had belonged to Old Man Hargrove before he died. But the children were here, and they were wet and hungry and scared, and he wasn't about to send them back out into the storm. "You're here now," he said. "We'll sort the rest in the morning. Both of you need to get out of those wet clothes." He found a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that had belonged to his son and handed them to Caleb. For Lily, he had nothing that would fit, so he gave her a clean towel and pointed her to the bedroom, where there was a spare blanket she could wrap herself in. While they changed, he built up the fire and put a pot of coffee on the stove. He was stirring the grounds when he heard a small sound from the table. The baby had finished the bottle and was looking up at Caleb with wide, unfocused eyes. Caleb was talking to her in a low, soothing voice that sounded far too old for a 10-year-old boy. "You're all right, Gracie. I've got you. I've always got you." Jeremiah's throat tightened. He turned back to the stove and busied himself with the coffee. When the children emerged, Caleb in clothes that were too big but dry, Lily wrapped in a blanket that dragged on the floor, Jeremiah set 2 bowls of stew on the table. It was leftover from the night before, thick with beef and potatoes and carrots, and he watched them eat with the focused hunger of children who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Lily ate slowly, deliberately, as if she was trying to make the food last. Caleb ate quickly, methodically, glancing up at the windows between every few bites. "You're watching for something," Jeremiah said. It wasn't a question. Caleb stopped chewing. He looked at his sister, then back at Jeremiah. "There's a man. He's been following us for 3 days. He has a black horse and a silver belt buckle shaped like a star. You know his name? Rhodes. Calvin Rhodes. He wants what our mother took." Jeremiah set down his coffee cup. "What did your mother take?" Caleb finished chewing, swallowed, and set down his spoon. He reached into the pocket of his wet jeans and pulled out a folded piece of paper, crumpled and damp, but still intact. He slid it across the table to Jeremiah. Jeremiah unfolded it. The handwriting was a woman's, small, fast, slightly slanted, and the message was short. "Please protect them. I will come when I can. Trust no one else." "She left this with us before she disappeared," Caleb said. "She told us to find the man with the white fence. She said you'd know what to do." Jeremiah read the note twice. He did not know the handwriting. He did not remember meeting their mother. But the children were here, and the storm was howling outside, and something told him that turning them away would be the kind of mistake a man carries to his grave. "We'll figure it out in the morning," he said again. "For now, you eat and then you sleep. I'll take the first watch." Lily looked at him with those old, unblinking eyes. "You're not going to send us away?" "No," Jeremiah said. "I'm not going to send you away." The girl's face did not change, but something in her shoulders relaxed, a tiny release of tension that spoke louder than any words. After they had eaten, Jeremiah showed Caleb and Lily to the spare room. It was small, with a single bed and a window that looked out onto the dark prairie. He found extra blankets in the trunk at the foot of the bed and left them to settle in. He took the baby, Grace, and laid her in a laundry basket he had lined with a flannel shirt. She was sleeping now, her breathing steadier, her cheeks less flushed. He set the basket on the floor next to his own bed, where he could keep an eye on her. Then he sat in his rocking chair by the hearth, a rifle across his knees, and listened to the storm rage outside. The hours passed slowly. The rain hammered the roof, the wind clawed at the walls. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, Jeremiah heard something that did not belong to the storm. The soft crunch of footsteps in the mud, just outside the front window. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He sat perfectly still, his hand closing around the stock of the rifle, and he listened. The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound, a low, deliberate scrape, like metal against wood. Someone was trying the latch on the barn door. Jeremiah rose from the chair, silent as a ghost, and moved to the front door. He cracked it open a sliver and peered out into the rain. The barn was a dark shape 30 yards away. He could see nothing moving, but there, a flicker of light, brief and yellow. A lantern, hooded, then extinguished. Someone was inside his barn. Jeremiah stepped out onto the porch, the rain immediately soaking his shirt. He raised the rifle to his shoulder and called out, his voice flat and hard as iron. "You've got 10 seconds to come out of my barn before I start firing, and don't stop." There was a moment of silence. Then the barn door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a slicker that gleamed wet in the darkness. He held his hands up, palms out, but there was no fear in his posture. "Easy there, friend," the man said. His voice was smooth, almost friendly, with an edge of amusement. "Just lost in the storm, looking for shelter. Didn't mean any harm." "You didn't lose your way," Jeremiah said. "You knew exactly where you were going. Now I'll ask you one more time. What do you want?" The man took a step forward, and Jeremiah cocked the hammer of the rifle. The sound was loud in the rain. The man stopped. He smiled. Jeremiah could see the flash of teeth in the dark. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me," the man said. "3 little things, 2 girls and a boy. I'm told they came this way." "You've been told wrong." The man's smile didn't waver. "Are you sure about that?" "Because I've got a long memory, friend, and I don't forget when someone takes what's mine." He reached into his slicker, and Jeremiah's finger tightened on the trigger. But the man only pulled out a silver pocket watch, glanced at it, then tucked it away. "I'll be going now, but I'll be back. And when I come back, I won't be asking." He turned and walked into the darkness. Jeremiah held the rifle for a long time after the sound of hoofbeats faded into the storm. Then he lowered it and went back inside, locking the door behind him. He stood in the dark kitchen, dripping wet, and looked at the closed door of the spare room where the children were sleeping. He looked at the laundry basket beside his bed, where Grace breathed softly. He thought about the note, and the man in the slicker, and the way Caleb had said Rhodes, as if the name itself was a curse. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the rocking chair, the rifle across his knees, and waited for the dawn to come. And when the first gray light crept over the horizon, he rose and made coffee, and started planning what he would have to do next. Because the man had said he would be back. And Jeremiah Cole had learned long ago that men like that never made promises they didn't keep. The question was whether he could protect these children long enough for their mother to come. And if she didn't come, if she never came, whether he was willing to become the thing those children needed him to be. The sun rose, and the rain stopped, and the world steamed under the heat of a new day. Jeremiah stood on the porch and looked out at the barn, where the tracks of the stranger's boots were already drying in the mud. Behind him, inside the cabin, a baby began to cry. And Jeremiah Cole, who had spent 8 years learning to live alone, walked back inside to answer the call. The morning came slow and reluctant, the sun struggling to push through a sky that was still heavy with the memory of rain. Jeremiah Cole stood on his porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hands, watching the steam rise off the prairie like the earth itself was breathing. The barn door hung slightly ajar, and the tracks in the mud were already drying into hard, cracked impressions, evidence of the man who had come in the night, the man who had promised to return. He heard movement behind him, the soft pad of bare feet on wooden floorboards, and turned to find Lily standing in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. She looked smaller in the morning light, thinner, her cheeks hollow in a way that suggested she had been hungry for longer than just the past few days. "Did you sleep?" Jeremiah asked. Lily shook her head. "I never sleep good. Not since we started running." She paused, then added, "But the baby slept. She didn't cry once after you gave her that bottle." Jeremiah nodded. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He had never been good with words, not even when Mary was alive. Mary had been the talker, the one who could fill a silence with stories and laughter, and the kind of warmth that made a house a home. Without her, he had learned to let silences stand. Lily came to stand beside him on the porch, looking out at the vast, empty landscape. The storm had washed the sky clean, and the horizon was a sharp line of blue against the brown earth. "Where do you think our mother is?" she asked. Jeremiah considered the question carefully. He had learned, over the years, that children deserved the truth as much as adults did, sometimes more. "I don't know," he said, "but I believe she's out there, and I believe she's trying to get back to you." Lily looked up at him with those eyes that seemed to see through everything. "Do you really believe that? Or are you just saying it because you think it's what I need to hear?" Jeremiah met her gaze and held it. "I really believe it." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, as if she had found what she was looking for. "Okay," she said. Then she turned and went back inside, leaving Jeremiah alone on the porch with his cold coffee and his thoughts. Caleb appeared a few minutes later, looking more rested than his sister, but still carrying that weight that no 10-year-old should have to bear. He had found one of Jeremiah's old flannel shirts and rolled up the sleeves to his elbows, and he stood in the kitchen with his hands on his hips, surveying the room like a general surveying a battlefield. "What's the plan?" he asked. Jeremiah set down his cup. "First, we eat. Then we figure out where to go from here." "We can't stay," Caleb said. "He knows where we are. He found us last night." "I know." Jeremiah moved to the stove and began to build up the fire. "But you can't run on an empty stomach, and neither can that baby. We've got time, not much, but some. Let's use it wisely." They ate a breakfast of salt pork, biscuits, and coffee, milk for Grace, who woke and drank hungrily from the bottle Jeremiah had prepared. The baby's fever had broken overnight, and her eyes were clearer, more alert, watching the world with the unfocused curiosity of an infant who had decided that maybe this place was safe enough to stay. While they ate, Jeremiah asked Caleb about their journey. The boy spoke in short, clipped sentences, as if each word cost him something. They had been on the move for 11 days, ever since their mother had left them with a neighbor and disappeared into the night. The neighbor had taken them to a church, and the church had passed them to a woman who ran a boarding house. And then the man with the silver buckle had found them, and they had run again. They had traveled by night, sleeping in ditches and abandoned barns, living on bread and water and whatever kindness strangers were willing to offer. And all the while, the man with the silver buckle had been one step behind them, always one night away, always closing the gap. "He's patient," Caleb said. "He doesn't rush. He just keeps coming." "Why?" Jeremiah asked. "What does he want?" Caleb hesitated. He looked at Lily, who was feeding small pieces of biscuit to her stuffed rabbit, absorbed in her own world. Then he looked back at Jeremiah and lowered his voice. "Our mother worked for him. She did the books. She found out that he was—" The boy stopped, his jaw tightening. "He was stealing people, workers. He would bring them up from Mexico, promise them jobs, and then when they couldn't pay him back for their passage, he would sell them. To other ranches, to mines, to places where they would work until they died, and no one would ever know their names." The words hung in the air, heavy and dark. Jeremiah set down his biscuit. He had heard stories about men like that, but he had never encountered one directly. The frontier was full of cruelty, but there was a special kind of evil in profiting off the desperation of others. "Your mother had proof?" he asked. Caleb nodded. "She copied the ledgers. She wrote down everything, names, dates, amounts. She said if she could get it to the right people, he would go to prison for the rest of his life. That's why she left. She said she had to get the evidence somewhere safe. And she never came back." Caleb's face hardened. "She will," she promised. Jeremiah looked at the boy, at the fierce, unyielding hope in his eyes, and he made a decision. "All right," he said. "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to stay here for today, let the baby rest, get some food into you. Tonight, we'll move. I've got a cousin in Amarillo. He's a lawyer. If anyone can get that evidence to the right people, it's him." "You're coming with us?" Caleb asked. "You're not going to send us off on our own?" "No," Jeremiah said. "You're not going alone." The boy's face did not change, but his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, as if a weight had been slightly shifted. It was the first time since he had arrived that Jeremiah had seen him show any sign of relief. The day passed slowly. Jeremiah kept the children inside, away from the windows, and he worked around the property with one eye always on the horizon. The sun climbed high and hot, burning off the last of the storm's moisture, and by midday the world had returned to its usual dry, dusty state. He saw no sign of the man with the silver buckle, but he knew better than to think that meant he was gone. Men like that didn't give up. They just waited. In the afternoon, Lily came out to the porch where Jeremiah was mending a harness. She sat down beside him, her legs dangling over the edge, and watched him work in silence for a while. Then she said, "Do you have any children?" Jeremiah's hand stilled. The question hit him like a blow to the chest, unexpected and sharp. He did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "I did. A son. He died when he was 4 years old. Fever." Lily nodded slowly, as if she had known the answer before she asked. "My mother says that when someone you love dies, they don't really leave. They just become part of the wind, and every time the wind blows, they're touching you." Jeremiah looked at her. Her face was serious, untroubled by the weight of what she was saying. She spoke as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Is that what you believe?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, "but I like to think it's true." She slid off the porch and walked back inside, leaving Jeremiah alone with the harness and the wind and the memory of a boy who had been gone for 30 years but still felt, sometimes, like he was standing just behind him. The evening came, and with it, a new tension. Jeremiah packed supplies into a satchel: dried meat, biscuits, a canteen of water, a few blankets. He loaded his rifle and checked the cylinder of his revolver. He did not plan on needing them, but he had learned long ago that planning and reality rarely aligned. Caleb helped, methodical and efficient, checking the cinch on the spare horse Jeremiah had saddled for Lily. The boy moved like someone who had done this many times before, and Jeremiah did not ask how many times. "We'll ride until midnight," Jeremiah said. "Then we'll stop and rest until dawn. If we push the horses, we can make Amarillo in 2 days." "What about the man with the silver buckle?" Caleb asked. "If he follows us, I'll deal with him." Caleb looked at him, and for the first time there was something like trust in his eyes. "Okay," he said. They left as the last light bled out of the sky. Lily rode in front of Jeremiah, bundled in a coat, her stuffed rabbit tucked inside for warmth. Caleb rode beside them, carrying Grace in a sling that he had fashioned from a blanket. The baby was quiet, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait. The prairie stretched out before them, dark and endless, and Jeremiah kept the horses at a steady trot, pushing them just enough to cover ground without exhausting them. The stars came out, bright and cold, and the wind whispered across the grass. For an hour they rode in silence. Then Lily said, "He's behind us." Jeremiah's hand went to his revolver. "How do you know?" "I feel him. I always feel him." Jeremiah looked over his shoulder. The prairie behind them was empty, a sea of darkness under the starlight. But he did not doubt her. He had learned to trust the instincts of children who had been hunted. He pushed the horses a little harder. They rode through the night, stopping only once to rest the horses and change Grace's blanket. The baby was fussy, but Caleb soothed her with a soft song that Jeremiah did not recognize. The melody was old and sad, full of longing, and it carried across the plain like the cry of a distant bird. "What is that song?" Jeremiah asked. "My mother used to sing it to us," Caleb said. "It's about a river that flows to the sea. She said that no matter how far apart we are, we're all flowing to the same place." Jeremiah said nothing. He thought about Mary, about his son, about all the people he had loved and lost. And he thought about the river that flows to the sea. They reached the outskirts of Amarillo as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The town was small but busy, with merchants opening their stalls and farmers driving wagons loaded with produce. Jeremiah led them through the streets to a narrow building with a wooden sign that read, "Law Offices of Henry Marsh." He helped Lily dismount and told Caleb to wait with the horses. "I won't be long," he said. He knocked on the door, and a man with spectacles and thinning gray hair opened it. Henry Marsh was Jeremiah's cousin, though they had not seen each other in years. He looked older than Jeremiah remembered, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Jeremiah," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "What brings you to town at this hour?" I need your help, Jeremiah said. It's a matter of life and death. Henry stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, tell me everything. Jeremiah told him the story about the children, the mother, the man with the silver buckle, the evidence that could put Calvin Rhodes away for the rest of his life. Henry listened without interrupting, his face growing graver with each word. When Jeremiah finished, Henry leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. This is serious, Jeremiah. If what you say is true, you're dealing with a man who has a lot of power and a lot of money. He won't let go easily. I know. And you're willing to put yourself in the middle of it, for children you didn't even know 3 days ago? Jeremiah thought about Lily's question on the porch, about the boy who carried his baby sister like she was the most precious thing in the world, about the wind that carried the memory of his own son. Yes, he said, I am. Henry studied him for a long moment, then he nodded. All right, let me see what I can do. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. I've got contacts in the federal government. If your evidence is as strong as you say, we can get it into the right hands. Jeremiah felt a weight lift from his chest, not entirely, but enough to let him breathe. Thank you, Henry. Don't thank me yet. We've got a long way to go. They spent the rest of the morning in the office, going over every detail. Henry wrote down everything Jeremiah could remember. Names, dates, the descriptions of the children and their mother. Then he made a series of phone calls, speaking in low, urgent tones to people whose names he did not share. At noon, he leaned back and said, I've got a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Fort Worth. He's willing to take the case if we can produce the evidence. But he needs the original ledgers, not just testimony. The mother has them, Jeremiah said. Then we need to find her. Jeremiah looked out the window. Caleb and Lily were sitting on the steps of the law office, sharing a piece of bread that Henry's secretary had given them. Grace was asleep in Caleb's arms, her face peaceful in the sunlight. We will, he said. We have to. That night, Jeremiah found a room at a boarding house on the edge of town. It was small and cheap, with 2 beds and a creaking floor, but it was safe. He put the children in one bed and took the floor for himself, his rifle within reach. Lily fell asleep almost immediately, her rabbit tucked under her chin. But Caleb lay awake, staring at the ceiling. You should sleep, Jeremiah said. I know. Then why aren't you? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm afraid that if I close my eyes, when I open them, she'll be gone. Jeremiah knew he was not talking about his mother. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I promised I'd see this through, and I keep my promises. Caleb turned his head to look at him. In the dim light, his eyes looked older than Jeremiah's. Why? He asked. Why do you care? You don't even know us. Jeremiah thought about the river that flows to the sea. He thought about the wind and the memory of his son. He thought about the way a child's hand feels when it trusts you enough to hold yours. Because everybody deserves someone who stays, he said. Caleb did not answer, but a moment later he closed his eyes, and for the first time in 11 nights he slept without dreaming of the man with the silver buckle. Dawn came to Amarillo like a slow unveiling, the light creeping across the prairie in shades of amber and rose, touching the rooftops one by one. Jeremiah Cole had not slept. He had lain on the floor with his rifle within arm's reach, listening to the creak of the boarding house and the distant bark of dogs and the soft, even breathing of 3 children who had, against all odds, trusted him enough to close their eyes. He rose before the sun cleared the horizon and stood at the window, watching the town come to life. A milk wagon rattled down the street. A blacksmith's hammer began its steady rhythm somewhere nearby. Normal sounds, the sounds of a place that had not been touched by the poison that had seeped into these children's lives. And Jeremiah knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that normal would not last. He had coffee waiting when Caleb woke. The boy came out of the bedroom, rubbing his eyes, his hair standing in every direction, and he looked at Jeremiah with that same measuring gaze he had worn since the night he arrived. But there was something new in it now, something softer, a crack in the armor. He took the cup Jeremiah offered and sat down at the small table without speaking. Henry's coming by at 8, Jeremiah said. He's got a name, someone who might know where your mother went after she left you. Caleb's hand tightened on the cup. Who? A woman named Tomasita Reyes. She runs a safe house near Lubbock. Henry says she's helped a lot of people in situations like your mother's. If anyone knows where she is, it's her. Why didn't she come to us? Why didn't she send word? I don't know, Jeremiah said honestly, but we're going to find out. Lily appeared in the doorway, Grace balanced on her hip. The baby was awake and alert, her eyes tracking the movement of light across the ceiling. Lily had managed to dress her in a clean cloth diaper and a too-large shirt that Jeremiah had found in the bottom of his saddlebag. She looked like a doll wrapped in a flag, but she was warm and fed and safe. She's hungry again, Lily said. Jeremiah nodded and moved to the small stove, where a pot of water was already heating. He had bought a tin of formula the evening before, along with a proper bottle, and he mixed it with the careful precision of a man who had learned that small things mattered. He handed the bottle to Lily, who took it with the same practiced ease she brought to everything, and sat down to feed the baby while Caleb finished his coffee. Henry arrived at 7:30, earlier than promised, his face carrying the weight of news. He sat down at the table without greeting, took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. I made some calls, he said. Tomasita Reyes is real, and she's willing to meet. But there's a problem. What kind of problem? Jeremiah asked. Rhodes has people everywhere. I mean everywhere. I made 3 calls, and within an hour, I got a message from a deputy sheriff in Potter County asking why I was making inquiries about someone named Reyes. They're watching the wires, Jeremiah. They're watching everything. Jeremiah felt the cold settle into his chest. Then how do we reach her? By going there. In person. She won't talk over the phone or through the mail. She says too many people have died that way. Lubbock is a day-and-a-half ride from here. I know. Henry put his spectacles back on. And I know that every mile you travel, you're exposed. But if this woman has the information we need, it's the only way. Jeremiah looked at Caleb, who had been listening to the exchange with his face unreadable. The boy's hands were wrapped around his coffee cup, but his knuckles were white. We leave in an hour, Jeremiah said. Henry reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is an address. It's not a house. It's a church on the outskirts of Lubbock, St. Catherine's. Tomasita uses it as a meeting place. Tell her Henry sent you, and she'll know what to do. Jeremiah took the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Thank you, Henry. Don't thank me yet. Just get there alive. Henry stood and shook Jeremiah's hand, then looked at the children. Godspeed, all of you. He was gone before the baby finished her bottle. The journey to Lubbock took them through country that grew harder and more barren with every mile. The lush grass of the northern panhandle gave way to scrub and rock, and the wind picked up, carrying dust that stung the eyes and coated the skin. Jeremiah pushed the horses as hard as he dared, stopping only to rest them and to feed Grace. They traveled in silence, the children too tired for talk, Jeremiah too focused on the horizon. They made camp that night in a dry wash, a shallow gully that offered some protection from the wind. Jeremiah built a small fire, just enough to heat water for the baby's formula and to warm a can of beans for the rest of them. They ate in silence, huddled around the flames, and the darkness pressed in on all sides. Lily was the first to break the quiet. Do you think she'll remember me? Jeremiah looked at her. She was staring into the fire, her face half in shadow, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Your mother? He asked. Yes. It's been so long. I don't want her to forget what I look like. Lily, Jeremiah said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Your mother has not forgotten you. She has not stopped thinking about you for 1 second since she left. That's not how mothers work. Lily looked at him, and for a moment she was just a little girl, vulnerable and scared, and desperately wanting to believe. How do you know? Because I had a mother, he said, and I know that the love a mother carries for her child is the strongest thing there is. Stronger than fear, stronger than distance, stronger than any man with a silver buckle. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded and turned back to the fire. But something in her posture had changed, a loosening, a softening. She believed him. And that, Jeremiah thought, was the hardest gift a child could give. Caleb had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now he spoke. We should keep moving. He's still out there. Jeremiah looked at the boy, at the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The horses need rest, so do you. I can't rest. Then lie down and close your eyes. Let your body rest, even if your mind won't. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Jeremiah's voice must have reached him, because he lay back on his blanket and stared up at the stars. Jeremiah watched him for a moment, then returned his gaze to the darkness beyond the fire, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. The night passed without incident, but Jeremiah did not sleep. He sat with his back against the wall of the gully, listening to the wind and the occasional cry of a distant coyote, and he thought about the man with the silver buckle. He thought about what it would mean to face him. He had killed before, in the war, in self-defense, in the hard country where a man sometimes had to choose between his life and another's. But it had been years, and he had hoped never to do it again. But he knew, with the same certainty that had settled into his bones that morning, that if it came to that, he would not hesitate. They reached Lubbock in the late afternoon of the second day. The church was a small adobe building on the edge of town, its whitewash faded and cracked, its bell tower leaning slightly to one side. A wooden cross stood above the door, and a single cottonwood tree provided shade in the dusty yard. Jeremiah helped Lily dismount and told Caleb to stay with the horses. He walked to the door and knocked. A woman opened it. She was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a bun, and a face that had seen a great deal of sorrow, but had not been defeated by it. Her eyes were dark and sharp, and they studied Jeremiah with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read people quickly. "You're Henry's cousin," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Come inside. Bring the children." They followed her into a small room with wooden benches and a simple altar. The air smelled of incense and old books. Thomasita gestured for them to sit, and she took a seat across from them, folding her hands in her lap. "Henry told me about your situation," she said. "He said you're looking for a woman named Sarah Voss." "That's right," Jeremiah said. "Do you know where she is?" Thomasita was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I do. But I need to know that I can trust you before I tell you." Jeremiah met her eyes. "I'm not here to hurt her. I'm here to help her. She has evidence that can put a bad man away, and she has children who need her." Thomasita's gaze shifted to Caleb and Lily, who were sitting on the bench, Grace asleep in Lily's arms. She studied them for a long moment, and something in her face softened. "Your mother is a brave woman," she said to them. "Braver than she knows." "Do you know where she is?" Caleb asked, his voice urgent. Thomasita looked at Jeremiah. "She came to me 10 days ago, alone, with nothing but a satchel and a revolver. She said she was being followed. She asked me to keep something safe for her." "The ledgers," Jeremiah said. "Yes, she gave them to me and told me that if she didn't come back within a week, I was to burn them. She said she'd rather they be destroyed than fall into the wrong hands." "And did she come back?" Thomasita's face grew grave. "No, she didn't." The room went still. Caleb's face drained of color, and Lily's grip on Grace tightened until the baby stirred and whimpered. "Where did she go?" Jeremiah asked. "She said she had to draw them away from you, from the children. She said she would lead them on a chase, give you time to get to safety." She headed south, toward the border. "Toward the border," Jeremiah repeated. "Alone." "Alone." Caleb stood up abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. "We have to go after her. We have to find her." "Son," Jeremiah said, his voice gentle but firm, "we don't know where she is. The border is 1,000 miles of nothing. We could search for months and never find her." "Then what do we do?" Caleb's voice cracked. "We just sit here and wait?" "No." Jeremiah looked at Thomasita. "The ledgers, where are they?" Thomasita rose and walked to the altar. She reached behind it and pulled out a leather satchel that had been hidden there. She brought it to Jeremiah and set it on the bench. "She trusted me with these," she said. "Now I'm trusting you." Jeremiah opened the satchel. Inside were a stack of ledgers, bound in dark leather, the pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. He did not open them. He did not need to. He knew what they contained, the names of the disappeared, the accounts of blood money, the proof of a man's evil. "These need to get to Fort Worth," he said. "To the U.S. Attorney's office." "I can arrange a rider," Tomasita said. "I know people who can get them there without being intercepted." "Do it." Tomasita nodded and left the room. Jeremiah sat down on the bench beside Caleb, who was staring at the floor, his jaw tight. "She's alive," Jeremiah said. "You have to believe that." "How?" Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. "How do you know?" "Because she's too stubborn to die." Jeremiah put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "And because she has 3 reasons to come back." Caleb did not answer, but he did not pull away. They spent the night in a small room at the back of the church, on cots that Tomasita brought out from storage. It was not comfortable, but it was safe, and after the days of travel, that was enough. Jeremiah slept in the doorway, his rifle across his knees, and he dreamed of a woman he had never met, running through the dark, running toward a river that flowed to the sea. In the morning, Tomasita came to them with news. The rider had left at dawn, carrying the ledgers toward Fort Worth. But she had also heard something else, a rumor, passed from a trader who had come through town the night before. 3 days ago, she said, a woman matching Sarah's description was seen in a small settlement called Esperanza, about 60 miles south of here. She was alone, and she was moving fast. Jeremiah was on his feet. Esperanza. It's not much of a town. A few houses, a general store, a way station for travelers heading to the border. If she's there, she won't be there for long. Then we leave now. Caleb was already gathering their supplies, his movements quick and purposeful. Lily had Grace in her arms, the baby wrapped in a clean blanket that Tomasita had provided. "I'll pack some food for the road," Tomasita said, "and I'll pray for you." Jeremiah looked at her. "Thank you, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," she said, echoing Henry's words. "Just bring her home." They rode south, into the heat and the dust and the vast, empty expanse of the Texas plains. The sun beat down on them, and the horses labored, but they pushed on, stopping only when they had to. Caleb rode with his eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for a sign, a shape, anything that might be his mother. They reached Esperanza as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The town was small and quiet. A handful of buildings clustered around a dusty main street. Jeremiah reined in his horse and surveyed the scene. "Stay close," he said, "and stay quiet." They rode slowly down the main street, past the general store, past the saloon, past a blacksmith shop that was closing for the night. At the end of the street, near the livery stable, a woman was drawing water from a well. Jeremiah's heart stopped. She was thin and worn, her dress patched and faded, her hair pulled back in a hasty knot. But there was no mistaking the set of her shoulders, the way she moved, the way she looked up as if she had sensed them before she saw them. Caleb was off his horse before it had fully stopped. "Mama!" The woman dropped the bucket and turned, and then she was running, and Caleb was running, and they met in the middle of the dusty street, her arms wrapping around him, his face buried in her shoulder. Lily was next. Grace pressed between them, and the 4 of them stood there in the fading light, holding each other, crying and laughing and trembling with a relief that was too big for words. Jeremiah stayed on his horse, watching from a distance. He had seen reunions before, in the war, in the years after, when families torn apart by violence and circumstance found each other again. But he had never seen one like this. This was a reunion paid for in fear and hunger and miles of hard travel. This was a reunion that had cost everything, and it was worth everything. Sarah Voss looked up at him, her eyes red and wet, and she mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Jeremiah nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. They went inside the small room Sarah had rented above the general store, and they talked until the candle burned down to a stub. Sarah told them everything, how she had led Rhodes's men on a chase across 3 counties, how she had buried the ledgers in a place she knew they would be found, how she had hoped and prayed that her children had made it to safety. And then she told them about a man named Jeremiah Cole, who had taken in 3 strangers in the middle of a storm and had not let them go. "You saved them," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved my children." "No," Jeremiah said, "they saved themselves. I just pointed the way." Caleb looked at him, and in that moment the boy's face was open and unguarded. The weight of months, finally, briefly, lifted. "Thank you," he said. Jeremiah did not answer. He just put his hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed. Outside, the wind blew across the prairie, carrying the dust and the memory of all the miles they had traveled. And somewhere to the north, a rider was carrying a satchel of ledgers toward a courtroom, where justice was waiting to be served. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, a mother held her children, and a man who had spent 8 years alone sat in a small room above a general store, listening to the sound of a family breathing, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt at home. The night in Esperanza passed like a held breath. Jeremiah sat in a wooden chair by the window of the small room above the general store, his rifle leaning against the wall within easy reach, and he watched the street below while the family slept. Sarah had taken the bed with Grace curled against her chest, Lily pressed to one side and Caleb on the other, the four of them tangled together in a way that spoke of desperate need, the need to feel each other's warmth, to confirm that this was real and not another cruel dream. Jeremiah had seen families reunite before, but never like this. Never with this raw, trembling intensity, as if they were all afraid that, if they let go, the world would snatch each other away again. The candle had burned out hours ago, and the only light came from the moon, thin and silver through the grimy window. He could hear Sarah's steady breathing, and beneath that, the occasional murmur of one of the children stirring in sleep. He did not sleep himself. He had learned long ago that sleep was a luxury a man could not afford when there was work still to be done, and the work was far from finished. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale pink, and with it came the sounds of the town waking, a rooster crowing somewhere, the creak of a wagon, the distant ring of a hammer on an anvil. Jeremiah rose and stretched, his joints protesting the long night in the chair. He moved quietly to the small stove in the corner and built a fire, setting water to heat for coffee and for the baby's formula. Sarah woke as the smell of coffee filled the room. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the children still sleeping around her, and met Jeremiah's eyes across the dim space. She looked thinner than he had imagined, her face marked by exhaustion and fear, but there was a strength in her that had not been broken. He saw it in the way she held herself, in the steadiness of her gaze. "You didn't sleep," she said. It was not a question. "I've gotten used to it." She nodded and eased herself out of the bed, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to move without waking others. She took the cup of coffee he offered and wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I have to tell you the rest of it," she said, her voice low. "Everything I didn't tell the children." Jeremiah sat down across from her. "I'm listening." She took a long breath, steadying herself. "The Ledgers are on their way to Fort Worth, but there's more than just Ledgers. There are names, people who helped Rhodes, people in positions of power who looked the other way. Sheriffs, judges, a state senator. If those names get out, a lot of powerful people are going to want me dead. Then we make sure those names get into the right hands before anyone knows they're coming. Tomasita's rider is good, but he's only one man. If Rhodes catches wind of what's happening, he'll have every road between here and Fort Worth watched." Jeremiah thought for a moment. "Then we don't stay on the roads. We take the backcountry, the old trails. I know this land better than any of Rhodes's men." "You'd do that? You'd take us all the way to Fort Worth?" "I told your boy I'd see this through. I keep my promises." Sarah looked at him, and something in her face shifted, a crack in the armor she had worn for so long. "You don't even know us. Why would you risk your life for strangers?" Jeremiah considered the question. He thought about Mary, about his son, about the long years of silence that had followed. He thought about the storm, and the knock on his door, and the 3 children who had changed everything. "Because everybody deserves someone who stays," he said. Sarah did not answer, but she reached across the table and put her hand on his, just for a moment, and that was enough. The children woke slowly, emerging from sleep with the groggy disorientation of those who had finally found rest after too long without it. Lily was the first to open her eyes, and she looked around the room with the careful assessment Jeremiah had come to recognize. When she saw her mother still there, still real, a smile broke across her face. A real smile, unguarded and full of light. She crawled across the bed and wrapped her arms around Sarah's neck. and Sarah held her with a ferocity that made Jeremiah look away. Caleb woke next. He did not smile. He did not rush to embrace his mother. He simply sat up, looked at her, and nodded once. But Jeremiah saw the way his shoulders dropped, the tension that had been coiled in him for weeks finally releasing. Grace woke last, squalling with the imperious demand of an infant who had decided she had been patient long enough. Sarah laughed, a sound so unexpected and so full of relief that it made Jeremiah's chest ache, and lifted the baby to her shoulder, patting her back with a practiced hand. "We need to move," Jeremiah said. "The longer we stay in one place, the easier we are to find." Sarah nodded. "There's a back stairway that leads to the alley. The livery stable is 2 blocks east. We can get horses there. And supplies. We'll need enough for at least a week, maybe more. I've got a little money left, not much, but enough. It'll have to be enough." Jeremiah stood and checked the load on his revolver. "I'll go to the stable and get the horses ready. You get the children dressed and pack what we can carry. We leave in 30 minutes. He was at the door when Sarah's voice stopped him. "Jeremiah." He turned. "Be careful." He nodded once and stepped out into the morning. The livery stable was run by a man named Otis, who had a missing front tooth and a habit of talking too much. He asked no questions when Jeremiah paid for 3 horses and a pack mule, taking the cash in silence and handing over the reins with a grunt. Jeremiah saddled the animals himself, checking each cinch and bridle with the methodical care of a man who knew that a loose strap could mean the difference between life and death. He was leading the horses out of the stable when he saw it. A dust cloud on the horizon, moving fast. His blood went cold. He tied the horses to a rail and walked quickly back to the general store, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He burst through the door to find Sarah with Grace in her arms. Lily and Caleb gathered around her, their faces pale. "They're coming," he said. "Riders, maybe 6 or 7. They'll be here in 10 minutes. Sarah's face went white, but her voice was steady. "The back stairs, now." They moved with the speed of people who had rehearsed this moment in their nightmares. Sarah grabbed the bag of supplies. Caleb took Lily's hand. Jeremiah snatched the rifle from beside the door and brought up the rear as they clattered down the narrow staircase and into the alley behind the store. The horses were still tied at the rail 2 blocks away, but they would never reach them in time. The riders were already entering the town, their horses at a gallop, their voices raised in shouts that echoed off the wooden buildings. "This way," Jeremiah said, pulling them into a narrow gap between 2 buildings, a space so tight they had to press sideways to move through it. It opened onto a small yard behind a blacksmith shop, where a pile of scrap metal provided cover. They crouched behind the rusted iron and watched the main street through the gaps. The riders had pulled up in front of the general store, 6 men in dust-covered coats, their faces hard and their hands on their weapons. The lead man dismounted and strode into the store, and Jeremiah heard the crash of furniture being overturned, the raised voice of the proprietor, and then silence, a long, terrible silence. Then the man emerged, holding something in his hand. Even from a distance, Jeremiah could see what it was. A piece of fabric, a strip of cloth that had been torn from a dress. Sarah's dress. The man held it up, and the other riders gathered around. He spoke to them in a low voice, and then they spread out, fanning through the town like a hand opening. "They're going to search every building," Jeremiah whispered. "We have to move, now." They crept along the back of the buildings, keeping low, using every scrap of cover the town offered. A pile of barrels, a hay wagon, a stack of firewood. The riders were methodical, working their way through the town, one structure at a time, and it was only a matter of minutes before they reached the blacksmith shop. Jeremiah made a decision. "There's an arroyo about half a mile east of town," he said. "Dry creek bed, deep enough to hide in. If we can make it there, we can follow it north until we're clear." "What about the horses?" Caleb asked. "We'll have to leave them. We'll find more on the other side." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." They ran. The ground was rough, littered with rocks and scrub, and the baby began to cry, a thin wailing sound that seemed to carry across the flat plain like a beacon. Sarah pressed her hand over Grace's mouth, trying to muffle the sound, but it was no use. Behind them, a shout went up, and then the drum of hooves. "Faster!" Jeremiah said. They reached the edge of the arroyo just as the first rider crested a rise behind them. Jeremiah pushed Lily down into the gully, then Sarah with the baby, and then Caleb. He turned and fired once, the shot going wide but forcing the rider to pull up. Then he threw himself over the edge, sliding down the loose dirt into the dry creek bed. The arroyo was deeper than he had hoped, its banks rising 8 feet above them, the floor covered in smooth stones, and the occasional pool of stagnant water. It twisted and turned, winding through the landscape like a scar, and they followed it as fast as they could, stumbling over the uneven ground, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The riders reached the edge of the arroyo and reined in, their voices echoing down the gully. "They went down there, spread out, cut them off." Jeremiah grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to find a place to climb out. If they get ahead of us, they'll trap us in here." They pushed on, the walls of the arroyo growing steeper as they went, the turns becoming sharper. Grace was crying continuously now, a sound that seemed to bounce off the walls and multiply, and Jeremiah knew that sound would lead the riders straight to them. Then he saw it, a break in the bank, where a flash flood had washed away the edge, creating a slope of rubble that led up to the open plain. It was their only chance. "Up there," he said. "Go." Sarah went first, scrambling up the loose rock with Grace pressed against her chest. Caleb followed, then Lily, then Jeremiah, climbing behind them with the rifle slung across his back. The rubble shifted under his boots, and he slid back twice, his hands bleeding from the sharp rocks. He heard the riders before he saw them. They rounded the bend in the arroyo below, their horses splashing through the stagnant water, and one of them raised a rifle and fired. The bullet struck the bank inches from Jeremiah's head, spraying dirt across his face. He threw himself over the top of the arroyo, landing hard on the flat ground, and rolled to his feet. Sarah was already running, the children behind her, heading toward a cluster of boulders that rose from the plain like a monument. They reached the rocks just as another bullet whined past, and they dove behind them, pressing themselves into the narrow gaps between the massive stones. "Are you hit?" Jeremiah asked, his voice urgent. "No," Sarah said, her breath coming in gasps. "No, we're all right." Jeremiah risked a look around the edge of the boulder. The riders had emerged from the arroyo and were spreading out, forming a line that cut off any retreat. There were 6 of them, heavily armed, and they moved with the confidence of men who had done this before. "We can't outrun them," he said. "We can't outshoot them. There's too many." Caleb looked at him, his face pale but determined. "Then what do we do?" Jeremiah looked at the children. He looked at Sarah. He thought about the Ledgers riding toward Fort Worth, about the river that flows to the sea, about all the promises he had made and intended to keep. "We fight," he said. He checked his revolver, 5 rounds left. The rifle had 3. It was not enough. It was never enough, but it was all he had. He stepped out from behind the boulder, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice carrying across the plain. "You want these children? You're going to have to come through me." The riders reined in, their horses tossing their heads. The lead man, the one who had gone into the general store, slowly dismounted. He was tall, with a silver belt buckle that caught the sun and threw it back in a blinding flash. Calvin Rhodes. He walked forward, his hands raised in a gesture that was almost friendly. He stopped about 30 feet away, close enough that Jeremiah could see the cold amusement in his eyes. "You're a brave man," Rhodes said. "I'll give you that. Stupid, but brave. Call it what you want. I'll make you a deal. Give me the woman and the children, and I'll let you walk away. You've got no stake in this. You don't know what she's done, what she's taken from me." "I know exactly what she's done," Jeremiah said. "She took the truth, and I've seen enough of this world to know that the truth is the only thing worth dying for." Rhodes's smile faded. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind blew across the plain, carrying the dust and the heat and the tension like a physical weight. Jeremiah's finger rested on the trigger, his eyes fixed on Rhodes's chest. Then, from behind him, a small voice spoke. "Mr. Cole?" It was Lily. She had crept up beside him, her stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand, her face pale but steady. "Lily, get back behind the rocks." "No." She stepped past him, standing in front of him, facing Calvin Rhodes. She was so small, so impossibly small, but she did not tremble. She did not flinch. She looked at Rhodes with those old, unblinking eyes, and she said, "You're not going to hurt us anymore." Rhodes laughed. It was a hard, flat sound, devoid of humor. "And who's going to stop me, little girl?" "Me," Lily said. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small object. It was a button, a simple brass button, worn and tarnished. She held it up, and Rhodes's laughter died. He stared at the button, his face going pale. "Where did you get that?" "From my mother. She said it belonged to your father. She said you'd know what it means." Rhodes took a step back. For the first time, something like fear flickered in his eyes. "I don't know what game you're playing," he said, his voice suddenly rough, "but it won't work." "Then why are you afraid?" Lily asked. The silence stretched. The riders shifted in their saddles, uncertain. Rhodes stood frozen, staring at the button in the little girl's hand. And then, from the north, came the sound of a steam whistle, long and low, carrying across the plain. A train. Jeremiah looked up. On the horizon, a plume of smoke was rising, moving fast. "Reinforcements," Rhodes said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Sarah said, stepping out from behind the boulder. "That's not your reinforcements. That's mine." She looked at the approaching train, and for the first time she smiled. "You sent the Ledgers to Fort Worth," she said. "But I sent a letter to someone else, someone who has been waiting for this moment for a very long time." Rhodes's face contorted. "You're lying." "Am I?" The train was closer now, its whistle blaring, its engine laboring as it slowed. Men were jumping from the cars before it had fully stopped, men in dark suits carrying badges and rifles. Federal marshals. Rhodes turned to run, but it was too late. The marshals were already fanning out, their voices sharp and commanding. His riders scattered, some trying to flee, others throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Rhodes stood alone in the middle of the plain, the silver buckle gleaming in the sun, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. And Lily stood facing him, the brass button still held in her small hand, watching as the men in dark suits surrounded him and took him away. The train had stopped, its engine hissing steam, and the lead marshal walked toward them. He was a tall man with a gray mustache and a kind face, and he took off his hat when he reached Sarah. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I'm Marshal Thomas Crane. I received your letter. I'm sorry it took us so long to get here." Sarah shook his hand, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "You're here now. That's what matters." Marshal Crane looked down at Lily, still holding the button. "That was some quick thinking, young lady. Where did you get that button?" Lily looked at her mother. Sarah nodded. "It was my grandfather's," Lily said. "My mother gave it to me before she left. She said it was the only thing that man was ever afraid of." Crane smiled. It seemed she was right. Jeremiah stood apart, watching the marshals load Rhodes into one of the train cars. He felt a hand slip into his, and looked down to find Caleb standing beside him. "You saved us," Caleb said. "We all saved each other," Jeremiah said. Caleb did not answer, but he did not let go of Jeremiah's hand. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning chill, and the train waited, its engine rumbling, ready to carry them north to Fort Worth and to whatever came next. And Jeremiah Cole, who had spent 8 years learning to be alone, looked at the family standing around him. A woman, 3 children, a stuffed rabbit, a brass button, and knew that he would never be alone again. The train carried them north through a landscape that seemed to unfold like a slow exhale. The vast plains giving way to rolling hills and scattered stands of cottonwood. Jeremiah sat by the window, his rifle propped against the seat beside him, watching the miles pass. He had not slept in more than 30 hours, but sleep would not come. His body was exhausted, but his mind was still running, still processing everything that had happened in the past 4 days. The steam engine chugged beneath them, a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to say, "Safe now, safe now, safe now." Sarah sat across from him with Grace asleep in her arms, the baby's face peaceful in a way Jeremiah had not seen since the night they arrived at his cabin. Lily was curled against her mother's side, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, her eyes closed, but not quite sleeping. Every few minutes she would twitch, a small shudder running through her body, and Sarah would stroke her hair and whisper something too low for Jeremiah to hear. Caleb sat beside Jeremiah, staring out the window at the passing country, his face unreadable. He had not spoken since they boarded the train. Marshal Crane had given them a private car, a small compartment with cushioned seats and a stove where they could heat water. One of his deputies had brought bread and cheese and a jar of honey, and they had eaten in silence, the first real meal any of them had shared without fear of interruption. It felt strange to eat without listening for hoofbeats, without glancing at the windows, without the cold weight of dread sitting in the stomach. Jeremiah caught himself doing it anyway, his hand drifting toward his revolver every time the train slowed or a door opened farther down the carriage. "It's going to take a while," Sarah said, her voice soft. "To stop looking over your shoulder." Jeremiah looked at her. "Does it ever stop?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know. I haven't gotten that far yet." The train stopped twice to take on water and coal. At each stop, Marshal Crane appeared at the door of their compartment to report that all was quiet, that Rhodes was secured, that they were making good time. At the second stop, he lingered, his hat in his hands, his expression thoughtful. "There's going to be a hearing tomorrow morning," he said. "The U.S. Attorney wants to move fast before Rhodes's lawyers can get their feet under them. He'll need Mrs. Voss's testimony." "I'll be there," Sarah said. "And the children?" "They stay with me." Crane nodded. "I'll arrange for a deputy to be outside your room at the hotel, just as a precaution." "Do you expect trouble?" Jeremiah asked. "I don't expect it, but I've been doing this long enough to prepare for it." He left, and the train lurched forward, carrying them into the fading afternoon. Fort Worth rose from the prairie like a promise made of brick and glass and the steady hum of industry. The train station was crowded, bustling with travelers and merchants and families reunited, and as they stepped off the train, Jeremiah felt the weight of the city press against him. He had not been to a place this large in years. The noise, the movement, the sheer number of people, it was overwhelming in a way that the quiet plains never were. A carriage was waiting for them, sent by the U.S. Attorney's office, and they rode through the streets toward the hotel. Lily pressed her face to the window, watching the buildings slide past, her eyes wide. "There are so many people," she whispered. "It's a city," Sarah said. "People live close together here. Why?" Sarah smiled, a tired, fragile thing. "I don't know, baby. I've never understood it myself." The hotel was a modest, three-story building on a quiet street, not grand but clean, with a lobby that smelled of beeswax and old wood. A deputy was stationed at the front door, and another in the hallway outside their rooms. Sarah had been given 2 adjoining rooms, one for herself and the children, one for Jeremiah, and she stood in the doorway of the children's room, looking at the beds with the clean white sheets, and did not move for a long time. "It's been so long since I slept in a real bed," she said. Jeremiah stood in the hallway, his hands in his pockets. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be hard." "I know." She turned to look at him. "What about you? Where will you go after this?" The question caught him off guard. He had not thought about what came after. He had been so focused on getting them here, on surviving each hour, that he had not allowed himself to look past the hearing. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I suppose I'll go back to the cabin." "To the cabin," she repeated the words as if testing their weight. "Back to the quiet." "Yes." She nodded, and something flickered in her eyes, something he could not name. "Well, you're welcome to stay, at least until the hearing is over. The children—" She stopped, started again. "Caleb asked me this morning if you were going to leave. He didn't say it to me directly, but I heard him ask Lily. He's worried." Jeremiah looked through the open door at the children. Caleb was sitting on the edge of the bed, untangling a knot in his shoelaces with the focused intensity he brought to everything. Lily was arranging her stuffed rabbit on the pillow, making sure it was comfortable. "I told him I'd see this through," Jeremiah said. "I meant it." "I know you did." Sarah met his eyes. "But after the hearing, after the trial, when it's all over, what then?" He did not have an answer. The hearing was held in a federal courthouse that rose from the center of Fort Worth like a fortress of stone and justice. The courtroom was paneled in dark wood, with tall windows that let in the morning light, and a flag hung behind the judge's bench. Jeremiah sat in the front row beside Sarah, with the children in the seats next to them. Lily had insisted on bringing her rabbit. Caleb sat stiff and straight, his hands on his knees, his jaw set. Calvin Rhodes was brought in wearing shackles. He had been cleaned up, his hair combed, his clothes pressed, but nothing could hide the hardness in his face, the cold calculation in his eyes. He did not look at Sarah. He did not look at the children. He looked straight ahead, at the judge, as if the people he had tried to destroy were beneath his notice. Jeremiah watched him and felt a quiet, steady anger settle in his chest. He kept his hand on his knee, fingers spread, ready. The U.S. Attorney, a woman named Margaret Holloway, laid out the case with the precision of someone who had been building it for months. She spoke of the ledgers, the witness testimony, the pattern of disappearances along the border. She spoke of Sarah Voss, who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. She spoke of the children who had been hunted across 300 miles of open country. When she finished, the judge looked at Rhodes. "Mr. Rhodes, how do you plead?" Rhodes's lawyer stood, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit. "My client pleads not guilty, Your Honor. These accusations are baseless, the testimony of a disgruntled employee who stole from my client and is now trying to save herself from prosecution." "Your Honor," Margaret Holloway said, "the evidence speaks for itself. I have 41 names. I have witness statements from 6 former employees. I have—" "Enough." The judge held up his hand. "Bail is denied. The defendant is remanded to federal custody pending trial. We will reconvene in 30 days. Rhodes did not react. He stood perfectly still, his face a mask, as the marshals led him away. But as he passed the front row, he turned his head, just slightly, and looked at Sarah. He did not speak. He did not need to. The look said everything. Sarah did not flinch. She held his gaze until he was through the door, and then she let out a breath she had been holding for weeks. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright and the air was warm, and the children sat on the steps while Sarah spoke with Margaret Holloway. Jeremiah stood a few feet away, watching the street, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "They'll set a trial date in the next few weeks," Margaret said. "With the evidence we have, I'm confident we'll get a conviction. But I won't lie to you. Rhodes has resources. He's going to fight this every step of the way." "I know," Sarah said. "I've been fighting him for months. I'm used to it." Margaret studied her. "You'll need to stay in Fort Worth until the trial. I can arrange for protective housing, a stipend for living expenses." "It won't be much, but it'll be enough." "Thank you. We'll also need to depose the children. Their testimony about the man with the silver buckle, that's important, especially Lily's." Sarah's face tightened. "She's 7 years old." "I know, and I wouldn't ask if it weren't necessary. But what she saw, what she remembers, it could make the difference." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "I'll talk to her." Margaret left, and Sarah walked over to sit beside Lily on the steps. The little girl leaned against her mother, her rabbit tucked under her arm. "Mama," Lily said, "is it over?" "No, baby," Sarah said, "not yet, but we're closer than we were. That man, the one with the button, he's in jail now?" "Yes." "Good." Lily said it with a finality that made Jeremiah's chest ache. She said it the way someone says a door is closed, a lock is turned, a chapter ended. Caleb stood up and walked over to Jeremiah. He stood beside him, looking out at the street, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then Caleb said, "What happens to you now?" Jeremiah looked down at him. "I don't know yet." "You could stay." The words were simple, direct, the way Caleb said everything. But there was something in his voice that Jeremiah had not heard before, a crack in the armor, a small opening. "I don't know if that's what your mother wants," Jeremiah said. "Have you asked her?" Jeremiah looked at Sarah, who was helping Lily stand up, brushing dust off her dress. She caught his eye and smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile. "No," he said, "I haven't." "Maybe you should." Caleb turned and walked back to his sisters, and Jeremiah stood alone on the courthouse steps, watching the family he had helped save, and wondered what it would mean to stay. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah knocked on Jeremiah's door. She stood in the hallway in a borrowed dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Can we talk?" she asked. He stepped aside and let her in. The room was small, with a single bed and a window that looked out onto the street. She sat on the edge of the bed, and he took the chair by the window. "Caleb told me what he said to you," she began, "about staying. He's a smart boy." "He is," she paused. "I haven't asked you because I didn't want to presume. You've already given us more than anyone has a right to ask for. I told you, I keep my promises." "I know, but this—" She gestured vaguely at the room, at the city beyond the window. "This isn't a promise. This is a choice. And I need you to know that whatever you decide, I understand." Jeremiah looked at his hands. They were cracked and calloused, the hands of a man who had worked hard every day of his life. He had built a cabin with these hands. He had buried his wife and son with these hands. He had carried a newborn through a burning barn and held a rifle against 6 riders. "What if I don't know what I want?" he said. Sarah smiled. "Then you're honest. That's more than most men can say." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city drifting through the window, distant laughter, the clatter of a wagon, the low hum of 1,000 lives being lived all at once. "You could come back with me," Sarah said quietly, "to the cabin, or wherever we end up. The children, they love you, Jeremiah, and I—" She stopped, looked down at her hands. "I don't know what I feel yet. Everything is still too raw. But I know that when I think about the future, I see you in it." Jeremiah felt something crack open in his chest. It was not the same crack that had opened when the children knocked on his door. It was deeper, older, a fissure that had been sealed for 8 years and was now, finally, beginning to give way. "I don't know how to be part of a family anymore," he said. "Neither do I, but maybe we can figure it out together." He looked at her. In the dim light of the hotel room, she was not the desperate woman who had ridden through the night to save her children. She was not the witness who had faced Calvin Rhodes in a courtroom. She was just a woman, tired and hopeful and brave, asking him to stay. "All right," he said. "All right? All right, I'll stay." She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply nodded, as if she had expected this answer, as if she had known it all along. "Good," she said. "The children will be happy." She stood and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob and looked back at him. "Jeremiah?" "Yes?" "Thank you for staying." Then she was gone, and Jeremiah sat alone in the small room, listening to the city hum, feeling the weight of his own heart beating in his chest. The next morning they found a small house on the edge of the city, a 2-story frame building with a porch and a yard big enough for a garden. Sarah used part of the stipend from the U.S. Attorney's Office to pay the first month's rent, and they moved in with nothing but what they had brought on the train. The children claimed their rooms with the fierce territoriality of those who had not had a room of their own in a very long time. Lily chose the smaller room, the one with a window that looked out onto the garden, and she immediately began arranging her stuffed rabbit and a few other belongings on the windowsill. Caleb took the room next to hers, a narrow space with a bed and a desk, and he spent the first afternoon building a bookshelf from scrap lumber he found behind the house. Grace learned to crawl that week. She had been threatening it for days, rocking back and forth on her hands and knees. And then one afternoon, in the middle of the kitchen floor, she lurched forward and took 3 unsteady crawls across the linoleum before collapsing onto her belly. Lily shrieked with delight, and Caleb came running from the other room, and the 3 of them gathered around the baby, cheering as if she had climbed a mountain. Jeremiah watched from the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand, and felt something warm and unfamiliar spread through his chest. Sarah came up beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. "She's getting big." "She is. Another few months, and she'll be walking." "Then we'll really be in trouble." Sarah laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind of laugh that had not come easily in a long time. "I think we can handle it." The hearing for the trial date was set for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, the depositions began. Margaret Holloway came to the house with a stenographer, and they sat in the parlor, asking questions that made Sarah's hands tremble and Lily's eyes go distant. Caleb answered his questions with the same flat directness he brought to everything, his voice never wavering, his hands folded neatly in his lap. When they finished with Lily, Margaret asked if she could speak to Jeremiah alone. They sat on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. "I wanted to thank you," Margaret said. "Personally. What you did, bringing those children across the country, protecting them, it made this case possible. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Margaret said. "You did what almost no one would have done. Don't confuse the two." Jeremiah said nothing. "I also wanted to let you know that we've received word from the sheriff's office in Red Hollow. The man who broke into your barn, the one who set the fire, he's been arrested. He confessed to everything, including Rhodes's involvement." Jeremiah felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a weight he had not fully realized he was carrying. "Good. The trial is going to be difficult. Rhodes is going to try to discredit Sarah, to paint her as a thief and a liar. But the evidence is strong. And the children's testimony, especially Lily's, will be powerful. She's a brave little girl." "She is." Margaret stood. "I'll be in touch about the trial date. In the meantime, try to rest. You've earned it." She left, and Jeremiah sat on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, thinking about the long road that had brought him here. That night, after the children were in bed, Sarah came out to sit with him. She brought 2 cups of tea and handed him one, then settled into the chair beside him. "The trial is going to be hard," she said. "I know. I'm afraid." "Me too." She looked at him. "You? I've never seen you afraid of anything." "That's because I'm good at hiding it." She smiled, but it faded quickly. She looked out at the darkening street, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet. "I don't know how to thank you, Jeremiah, for everything, for the children, for—" She gestured at the house, at the life they were building. "For this." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." She turned to face him. "Before you, I was running. I was surviving. I wasn't living. And now—" She stopped, her voice catching. "Now? Now I think I might be able to live again." Jeremiah set down his cup and took her hand. It was a small gesture, simple and unremarkable, but it felt like the most important thing he had done in years. "Then we'll live," he said, "together." She squeezed his hand, and they sat in the quiet, watching the stars come out one by one. The trial was set for the first Monday in September, and for the first time in 8 years, Jeremiah Cole looked forward to tomorrow. The morning of the trial came gray and heavy, a sky full of clouds that threatened rain but would not commit. Jeremiah stood at the window of the small house, watching the street below, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He had not slept. He had lain beside Sarah, listening to her breathe, feeling the tension in her body even in sleep. And he had stared at the ceiling and thought about Calvin Rhodes. Behind him he heard movement, the soft pad of bare feet on the wooden floor. He turned to find Caleb standing in the doorway, already dressed in the clean shirt Sarah had ironed the night before. The boy's hair was combed, his face washed, but his eyes were the same as they had always been, old and watchful, and carrying more than a 10-year-old should. "You ready?" Jeremiah asked. "No," Caleb said, "but I'm going anyway." Jeremiah nodded. There was nothing else to say. Sarah came down the stairs with Grace on her hip, Lily trailing behind her. Lily had put her stuffed rabbit in a small cloth bag that hung from her shoulder, and she carried it as if it were a talisman. She had not spoken much since waking, but she had eaten her breakfast without prompting, and she had let her mother brush her hair without complaint. Sarah looked at Jeremiah, and he saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been there the night she sent her children into a storm. But he also saw something else, a steel that had been forged in the months of running, a determination that would not be broken. "Let's go," she said. The courthouse was surrounded by reporters. They had gathered on the steps like crows, their cameras and notepads ready, their eyes hungry for a story. Jeremiah pushed through the crowd with the children close behind him, Sarah at his side, a wall of deputies clearing the way. Flashbulbs popped, voices shouted questions, but he did not hear them. He heard only the sound of Lily's small hand gripping his, the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The courtroom was full. Every seat was taken, and the gallery buzzed with the low murmur of expectation. Jeremiah led the children to the front row, where seats had been reserved for them. Sarah sat between Lily and Caleb, Grace in her lap, and Jeremiah took the seat beside Caleb, his hands resting on his knees. Calvin Rhodes was brought in a few minutes later. He wore a dark suit, his hair trimmed, his face composed. He looked like a businessman, a respected member of the community. But when his eyes swept the room and landed on Sarah, Jeremiah saw the coldness there, a predator's patience, a wolf's hunger. The judge entered, and the room rose. The proceedings began. Margaret Holloway opened with a statement that painted a picture of greed, corruption, and cruelty. She spoke of 41 men and women who had crossed the border looking for work and had vanished into the machinery of Rhodes's empire. She spoke of a woman who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. She spoke of children who had been hunted across 300 miles of open country. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. The defense attorney rose. He was a silver-haired man named Charles Winthrop, and he spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who had been paid a great deal of money to make the truth bend. He painted Sarah as a disgruntled employee, a woman who had stolen from her employer and was now trying to save herself by destroying a good man's reputation. Jeremiah clenched his fists, but kept his face still. Sarah was called to the stand first. She walked with her head high, her hands steady, and she swore to tell the truth. Margaret guided her through the story, the job at Rhodes Construction, the discovery of the ledgers, the decision to copy them, the flight into the night. "When did you realize you were in danger?" Margaret asked. "The day I found the names," Sarah said. 41 names of people who had come to work for him and never left. I knew then that if he found out what I knew, he would kill me. "And what did you do?" "I ran. I took my children and I ran." Cross-examination was brutal. Winthrop circled her like a hawk, trying to find a crack in her story. He questioned her about the ledgers, about why she had not gone to the police, about the money she had taken from the office safe before she fled. "Did you take that money?" Winthrop asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "To feed my children, to keep them alive." "You admit to theft." "I admit to survival." The judge's gavel came down. "Counselor, move on." Winthrop smiled. No further questions. Caleb was called next. He walked to the stand with the same composed stride he used for everything, his shoulders straight, his face unreadable. He was sworn in, and Margaret asked him about the night they left their home. "Tell me about the man with the silver buckle," Margaret said. Caleb's voice did not waver. "He came to our house. I saw him through the window. He had a silver buckle on his belt, shaped like a star. He talked to my mother at the door, and when he left, she was shaking." "Did you ever see him again?" "Yes. On the road. He followed us. He never stopped following us." "And how did that make you feel?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Like I was never going to see my mother again." The courtroom was silent. Jeremiah saw a woman in the gallery wipe her eyes. Winthrop's cross-examination of Caleb was brief. He tried to suggest that the boy had been coached, that his memories were influenced by his mother. But Caleb answered every question with the same flat, direct honesty, and Winthrop gave up. Then Lily was called. She was so small that the bailiff had to lower the witness stand microphone for her. She climbed into the chair with her cloth bag in her lap, her legs dangling, her feet not quite touching the floor. She looked out at the courtroom, at all the faces staring at her, and she did not blink. Margaret's voice softened. "Lily, can you tell me what you remember about the man who came to your house?" Lily reached into her bag and pulled out the brass button. She held it up, and a murmur rippled through the gallery. "He had a ring," Lily said, "a big gold ring, and a belt with a silver buckle. But my mother told me to look at his button. She said that button was the only thing he was ever afraid of." Winthrop was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay." "Overruled," the judge said. "Continue." Lily looked at the button in her hand. "My grandfather gave it to him, before my grandfather died. He said it was a reminder of where he came from. But the man forgot. He forgot where he came from. He forgot everything except being mean." Her voice was clear and steady, carrying through the silent room like a bell. "He hurt people," Lily said. "He hurt a lot of people. But he's not going to hurt us anymore." She looked directly at Calvin Rhodes. "Are you?" Rhodes did not answer, but his face, for just a moment, lost its composure. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or the recognition that he had been seen by a child who could not be fooled. Winthrop declined to cross-examine. The prosecution rested. The defense called no witnesses. In his closing argument, Winthrop argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Sarah Voss was a liar and a thief, that the children had been manipulated. But even as he spoke, Jeremiah could see that the jury was not convinced. They had heard Lily. They had seen the button. They had watched Sarah hold her ground. The judge instructed the jury and sent them to deliberate. The family waited in a small room down the hall from the courtroom. Sarah sat in a wooden chair with Grace asleep in her arms. Lily curled up on a bench with her head in her mother's lap. Caleb standing by the window, watching the street below. Jeremiah paced. "How long does it usually take?" Caleb asked. "It could be hours," Jeremiah said. "It could be days. I don't want to wait days." "No one does." The afternoon passed slowly. A deputy brought sandwiches and coffee, but no one ate. The light through the window shifted from gray to gold as the clouds broke and the sun came out. Still, no word. Lily fell asleep on the bench. Caleb sat down beside her and stared at the floor. At 6 in the evening, there was a knock at the door. Jeremiah opened it to find Margaret Holloway, her face drawn and tired. "They've reached a verdict," she said. Sarah stood up, Grace stirring in her arms. "Already?" "Already." They filed back into the courtroom. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The judge asked the foreman to stand. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "What say you?" The foreman unfolded the paper and read, "On the charge of involuntary servitude, we, the jury, find the defendant, Calvin Rhodes, guilty. On the charge of witness tampering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty." Sarah's breath caught. Jeremiah felt his knees go weak. The foreman continued, reading a list of charges, 18 in total, and on every single one, the verdict was the same: guilty. The judge set sentencing for 30 days later. Calvin Rhodes was led away in chains, his face white, his eyes fixed on some distant point that no one else could see. And the family stood together in the courtroom, holding each other, as the weight of months finally, completely lifted. They walked out of the courthouse into the evening light, and the reporters rushed toward them, but Jeremiah held up his hand. "Not today," he said. "Today, they rest." He led them through the crowd, past the cameras and the shouting, to a carriage that waited at the curb. They climbed in, and the driver flicked the reins, and they rode away through the streets of Fort Worth as the sun set behind them. Lily leaned against her mother, her eyes heavy. "Is it really over?" "Yes, baby," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "It's really over." Caleb looked out the window at the city passing by. "What happens now?" Jeremiah looked at Sarah. She looked at him. "Now," he said, "we go home." And for the first time in all the miles they had traveled, they were not running from something. They were running toward something. A home, a future, a family that had been forged in fire and would not break. The sentencing hearing was held on a Friday morning in early October, when the leaves had begun to turn and the air carried the first hint of winter. The courtroom was less crowded than it had been for the trial. The reporters had moved on to fresher stories. The curious had found other entertainments. But the family sat in the same front row, in the same seats, their hands clasped together in a chain that stretched from Sarah to Lily to Caleb to Jeremiah, with Grace balanced on her mother's lap, chewing on the collar of her dress. Calvin Rhodes stood before the judge in an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face a mask of controlled indifference. He had been convicted on all 18 counts. His empire had crumbled. His name, once spoken with fear and respect in certain circles, was now a curse, a byword for cruelty and greed. But he stood straight, his shoulders back, as if he still believed he was the one in control. Judge Castellano, the same judge who had presided over the custody hearing months earlier, looked down at Rhodes with an expression of cold assessment. She had seen many men stand before her in this position. Some were repentant, some were defiant, some were simply broken. Rhodes was none of those things. He was something else entirely, a man who believed, even now, that the rules did not apply to him. "Calvin Rhodes," the judge said, her voice carrying through the silent room, "you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the very foundation of human decency. You exploited the vulnerable. You profited from suffering. You attempted to destroy a family that dared to stand against you. The law exists to protect the helpless from the powerful, and you used your power to prey on the helpless. That is a sin this court will not tolerate." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I further order that any assets derived from your criminal enterprises be seized and distributed to the families of the victims whose names appear in the ledgers. And I recommend that you spend the rest of your natural life contemplating the damage you have done." Rhodes did not flinch. He did not speak. The marshals took him by the arms and led him away, and the door closed behind him with a sound like a stone dropping into still water. Sarah let out a breath she had been holding for months. Lily leaned into her side. Caleb sat very still, his hands in his lap, his face unreadable. And Jeremiah felt something release in his chest, a tightness that had been there so long he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Judge Castellano looked down at them, and her expression softened. "Mrs. Voss, the court thanks you for your courage. Without you, these crimes might never have come to light. You have given a voice to those who could not speak for themselves. I hope you can now find peace." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The judge nodded, and the court was adjourned. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright October sunshine. The sky was a deep, clear blue, and the air was crisp and clean. The leaves on the trees along the street had turned gold and red, and they rustled in the breeze like the sound of applause. Lily stopped on the steps and looked up at the sky. "Mama, is it really over now?" Sarah knelt down beside her, her eyes wet. "Yes, baby, it's really over, and we don't have to run anymore. We don't have to run anymore." Lily thought about this for a moment. Then she reached into the small cloth bag she carried and pulled out the brass button. She looked at it, turning it over in her small hand. "What should I do with this?" she asked. Sarah looked at Jeremiah. He considered the question, then said, "I think you should keep it, as a reminder of how strong you are." Lily nodded and tucked the button back into her bag. Then she took her mother's hand, and they walked down the steps together. The weeks that followed were a slow settling, like dust after a storm. They stayed in the small house on the edge of Fort Worth, and bit by bit, they made it their own. Sarah planted a garden in the yard, tomatoes, peppers, a few herbs, and she spent her mornings in the dirt, her hands in the soil, as if she was planting roots of her own. Jeremiah built a porch swing from scrap lumber, and in the evenings they would sit on it together, watching the sun go down, listening to the children play in the yard. Grace learned to walk in November. She took her first unsteady steps across the kitchen floor, her arms outstretched, her face a mask of concentration. And when she reached Sarah, she collapsed into her mother's arms with a shriek of triumph. Lily clapped and cheered. Caleb smiled, a real smile, not the careful one he wore for the world. And Jeremiah stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his heart full. Caleb spent his days in the small workshop Jeremiah had built behind the house. He had taken to woodworking with the same focus he brought to everything, learning the names of the tools, the feel of the grain, the patience required to shape a piece of wood into something useful. Jeremiah taught him what he knew, and Caleb absorbed it like dry ground absorbing rain. They worked in comfortable silence, the rhythm of saw and hammer filling the afternoons. One evening, as they were cleaning up, Caleb said, without looking at Jeremiah, "I think I want to be a carpenter when I grow up." Jeremiah wiped his hands on a rag. "That's a good trade. Honest work. Is that what you wanted to be?" "I wanted to be a lot of things, but I ended up where I needed to be." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm glad you ended up here." Jeremiah did not trust himself to speak. He just put his hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed. Lily had taken to drawing. She filled notebooks with sketches of the world around her, the garden, the house, her mother's face, Grace's tiny hands. She drew the prairie from memory, the vast empty spaces she had crossed, and in every drawing there was a small figure in the distance, watching over the landscape. One afternoon she showed Jeremiah a drawing she had done of him. It was simple, rendered in charcoal, but it captured something: the set of his jaw, the tired kindness in his eyes. He looked at it for a long time. "That's good," he said. "It's you," Lily said. "I wanted to remember you like this. I'm not going anywhere." "I know, but I still wanted to draw it." Jeremiah tucked the drawing into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Sarah wrote letters. She wrote to the families of the victims whose names had appeared in the ledgers, telling them what had happened, offering what comfort she could. Some wrote back, thanking her. Some did not. But she kept writing, kept reaching out, as if she could mend something that had been broken. She also wrote to the federal marshals who had helped them, and to Tomasita Reyes, and to Henry Marsh. She wrote to them all, telling them they were safe, telling them they were free. And she wrote a letter to the judge, thanking her for her courage. One night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Jeremiah sat on the porch swing. The air was cold, and Sarah had wrapped herself in a quilt. Jeremiah had his arm around her, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. "I've been thinking," Sarah said. "About what?" "About what comes next. The children are settled. The trial is over. I don't have to keep running." She paused. "But I don't know how to stop." Jeremiah considered this. "I don't think stopping is something you do all at once. I think it's something you learn, day by day." "Did you learn it?" "I'm still learning." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I want to marry you, Jeremiah." The words hung in the air, simple and direct, the way Sarah said everything that mattered. Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He looked at her face in the starlight, at the woman who had run through the dark and come out the other side. He thought about the night she had knocked on his door, about the storm and the children, and the long road they had traveled. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I don't need a ring. I don't have a lot to offer. You have yourself. That's all I want." He took her hand. "Then yes, I'll marry you." She smiled, a smile that lit up her whole face, that made her look younger, lighter, free. She leaned in and kissed him, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the wind carried the promise of winter. They were married on the first Saturday in December, in a small ceremony at the church on the edge of town, the same church where they had first met Tomasita Reyes. She had come for the wedding, sitting in the front pew with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Henry Marsh had come too, and Marshall Crane, and a few people from the neighborhood who had become friends. Lily was the flower girl, scattering petals from a basket with the solemn concentration of one who took her duties seriously. Caleb stood beside Jeremiah as his best man, his back straight, his face composed, though his eyes were bright. Grace sat in Sarah's arms during the ceremony, reaching for the flowers in Lily's basket, babbling in a language only she understood. The preacher spoke of love and commitment, of the bonds that hold people together through hardship and joy. He spoke of the frontier spirit, of the people who built lives from nothing, who faced the wilderness and the unknown, and came out stronger. And when he pronounced them husband and wife, and Jeremiah kissed Sarah, the small congregation burst into applause. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the church hall. Someone had made a cake. Someone else had brought a fiddle. The children ran between the tables, laughing, and the adults talked and ate and danced. Jeremiah stood at the edge of the room, watching it all, a cup of punch in his hand. He felt a small hand slip into his and looked down to find Lily. "Are you happy?" she asked. He smiled. "Yes, I'm very happy." "Good." She squeezed his hand and ran off to join her brother. Sarah came up beside him, Grace on her hip. "What are you thinking about?" "About how I got here," he said. "About the night you knocked on my door. If I had turned you away." "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." She leaned into him. "That's what matters." The winter passed quietly. Snow fell on Fort Worth, blanketing the streets in white, and the family huddled together in the warm house, reading by the fire, telling stories, learning to be still. Caleb carved a wooden horse for Grace, sanding it smooth until it gleamed. Lily drew a picture of the whole family, Sarah, Jeremiah, Caleb, herself, and Grace, and hung it on the wall above the fireplace. Sarah baked bread, filling the house with the smell of yeast and warmth. And Jeremiah built a bookshelf for the children's room, filling it with stories he had loved as a boy. In the spring, they planted a garden together, rows of vegetables and flowers that stretched across the yard. Lily planted sunflowers because they were tall and bright and reminded her of the prairie. Caleb built a trellis for the beans, his careful hands measuring and cutting with precision. Grace crawled through the dirt, pulling up seedlings as fast as they planted them. In the summer, they sat on the porch swing in the evenings, watching the fireflies blink in the gathering dark. The children grew. Grace learned to say Mama and Dada, and a word that sounded like Lily but came out as wee-wee. Caleb's hands grew calloused from his work in the shop. Lily filled another notebook with drawings. And Jeremiah Cole, who had spent 8 years alone, found himself surrounded by a family that had chosen him, that had come to him through a storm and stayed. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Sarah came to sit beside him on the porch. She handed him a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it." He unfolded it. It was the note. The same note she had given to Caleb that night. The one that said, "Please protect them all. Someone is looking for us." The paper was worn and creased, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. "I found it in the bottom of my bag," she said. "I've been carrying it all this time." Jeremiah looked at it. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I wanted you to see what you did." She took his hand. "I wrote that note when I had nothing left. I wrote it because I was sending my children into the dark, and I didn't know if I would ever see them again. But you caught them. You held them. You brought them home." He looked at the note, then at her. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," she said. "You did what no one else did. You stayed." He folded the note and put it in his pocket, next to the drawing Lily had given him. They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple. The children's voices drifted from inside the house, Lily laughing, Caleb answering, Grace babbling in her own language. This is the thing about the frontier, Jeremiah thought. It takes everything you have, your strength, your hope, your faith, and it gives back what you need, if you're brave enough to keep going. The people who survive on this hard land aren't the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. They are the ones who stay, the ones who open their doors in a thunderstorm, the ones who carry a newborn through a fire, the ones who keep going, one step at a time, even when the road seems to lead nowhere. And sometimes, if they're lucky, they find a family. Not the one they were born into, but the one they build, the one that chooses them. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.